Everything you think you know about artificial intelligence, the winners, the losers, the global balance of power, is about to be challenged. But with a rupture so deep that policymakers, investors, and even the tech giants themselves are still pretending it didn't happen. America believed the AI revolution was its destiny, that innovation would flow outward from Silicon Valley to the rest of the world in a neat, predictable hierarchy. And for a while, that assumption held. But then China did something unexpected. Something that didn't fit America's script. Something that quietly and then very loudly popped the AI bubble the US spent years inflating. This isn't a simple story of who built the best model. It's a story about fragility, about economic illusions, about geopolitical blind spots, and about a technological Cold War where the rules changed in real time, faster than anyone could adjust. Today, we're telling the entire story, the origins, the rise, the breaking point, the fallout, the failed fixes, and the unnerving parallels emerging today. By the end of this video, you'll understand how China forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. AI supremacy is not guaranteed. AI bubbles don't burst from the inside. They burst when someone outside the system refuses to play by the expected rules. To understand how the bubble began, we need to go back to a single moment in late 2022 when America shocked the world. It started with the release of ChatGPT, an unassuming interface powered by a model called GPT 3.5. It could reason, write, code, debate, explain, summarize, critique, and create. Suddenly AI wasn't abstract, it wasn't futuristic. It was here in real time, working on everyday problems for everyday people. Within weeks, GPT-4 arrived, more powerful, more coherent, more capable. By early 2023, every global institution, from governments to banks to universities, assumed one thing. The United States had an insurmountable lead in artificial intelligence. This belief became so widespread and so deeply embedded that markets priced it as if it were a natural law. Venture capitalists poured billions into AI startups whose entire business model was, we will eventually be acquired by a larger American AI company. Wall Street valued companies like NVIDIA, Microsoft, Google, and AMD as if the future of intelligence itself could only be built on American soil. Policymakers used this belief to justify export controls, sanctions, and chip restrictions. Because why not? America was already ahead by years. Meanwhile, analysts declared that China was technologically stuck. They argued that Chinese researchers lacked access to GPUs, lacked open scientific culture, lacked global data, lacked compute scaling expertise, and lacked access to Western model weights. And because these assumptions were repeated so many times by so many authoritative voices, they crystallized into a belief system. A rigid worldview, the foundation of the AI bubble. The problem, almost none of these assumptions were fully true. The rise of the bubble felt inevitable at first. American companies produced breakthrough after breakthrough. ChatGPT hit 100 million users faster than any consumer product in history. Microsoft integrated AI into Windows, Office, GitHub, and Bing. Google launched Bard, then Gemini. Meta open-sourced the Ma and changed the landscape again. Every sector, from finance to healthcare to education, pivoted toward AI automation. Every global forum described the US as the world leader in generative AI, and every investor believed they were buying into not just a trend, but a future monopoly. Meanwhile, chip companies saw demand explode. NVIDIA became the fastest-growing trillion-dollar company in history. AI data centers multiplied. GPU shortages turned into record prices. It seemed like nothing could slow the American AI machine. Every narrative, economic, political, ideological, reinforced the same idea. China couldn't compete. Export controls blocked China from acquiring cutting-edge chips like the A100, and H100 US patents dominated transformer architectures. American universities attracted the top machine learning talent. Silicon Valley served as the gravitational center for global AI development. So when China announced new AI models in early 2023, most Western analysts dismissed them. Copies, they said. Inferior. Not a threat. But privately, something else was happening. Something few people outside the intelligence community understood. China wasn't running behind. China was building parallel AI infrastructure deliberately, strategically, and entirely outside the American ecosystem. The origins of China's AI counter-strategy go back years. After Snowden revealed U.S. digital surveillance capabilities in 2013, China accelerated plans to build a sovereign technology stack. By 2017, Beijing declared AI a national priority and invested in compute clusters, indigenous semiconductor research, national data repositories, and academic partnerships. But the decisive push came after the U.S. restricted Huawei in 2019. That moment convinced Beijing that America would eventually try to cut China off from the entire computational supply chain. And so, long before GPT-4 shocked the world, China quietly prepared for a scenario in which it would be locked out of advanced chips. Instead of chasing American hardware, China focused on software efficiency, training, optimization, quantization model compression, distributed compute, alternative architectures, and critically, China built its own domestic GPU ecosystems. Not always competitive at first, but improving rapidly. By the time America believed China was falling behind, China had already taken a different path. They weren't trying to copy Silicon Valley. They were trying to replace the parts of Silicon Valley they could no longer access. And that divergence, unnoticed at first, would later trigger a shock that rippled through the global AI economy. The breaking point came in 3 stages, each one more disruptive than the last. The first shock arrived when Chinese companies began releasing models that matched or exceeded Western models trained on more powerful hardware. When Alibaba, Baidu, and Steinmeier and Jipu AI began publishing competitive benchmarks, Western analysts scrambled to explain it. How could China produce GPT-4 level performance without GPT-4 level GPUs? The answer was simple: software efficiency. China had been forced to master techniques America didn't prioritize because America never had to. Chinese labs developed training pipelines that used fewer resources. They mastered high-performance optimization under constrained conditions. They developed quantization methods that preserved accuracy at extremely low bit. They trained large models using distributed clusters of weaker chips, something American companies avoided because they didn't have to innovate around scarcity. In other words, the US relied on brute force. China relied on ingenuity, and ingenuity scales in unexpected ways. The second shock came when China began releasing open source models that rivaled or exceeded Western models. These weren't small models. These weren't toys. These were high-performance, multimodal, commercially viable models released openly into the global ecosystem, free of Western licensing restrictions. Suddenly, every startup in India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East had access to models they no longer needed to license from Silicon Valley. The global AI stack, once dominated by American companies, began to fragment. And for the first time, developers had an American foundation model with competitive benchmarks. Investors started asking uncomfortable questions. What if America didn't have a monopoly? What if market share assumptions were wrong? What if global AI adoption wouldn't depend on a handful of US tech giants? These weren't academic questions. These were trillion-dollar questions, and they cut straight into the hard evaluations for American AI companies. But the third shock, the one that truly popped the bubble, came when China demonstrated that it could scale AI without American GPUs, not partially, not experimentally. Fully, China revealed domestic chips capable of training frontier-scale models. Chinese labs published papers showing that clusters of domestic accelerators, while less powerful individually, could produce models that matched Western systems when integrated with optimized pipelines. Suddenly, the core American assumption collapsed that US export controls would slow China's progress for years. They didn't. China simply bypassed the bottleneck. And once that illusion broke, the bubble popped, because the bubble wasn't built on AI itself. The bubble was built on American AI exceptionalism and the belief that competition wouldn't arrive for decades. Now, it wasn't decades, it wasn't years, it wasn't theoretical, it was here. The fallout hit fast. Venture capital funding began shifting. Western AI startups that relied on American monopoly narratives saw their valuations questioned. Investors demanded profitability instead of hype. Companies built entirely around reselling API access to US foundation models found themselves suddenly irrelevant. Corporations that assumed they needed only American models now explored alternatives. Meanwhile, the US government, having assumed export controls would freeze China, scrambled to redesign restrictions, new sanctions, new chip rules, new compliance guidelines, but none of them addressed the core problem. China no longer needed. American chips to scale AI export controls can restrict hardware. They cannot restrict ingenuity. They cannot restrict algorithmic efficiency. They cannot restrict open innovation outside US jurisdiction. The bubble didn't pop because China surpassed America. It popped because China eliminated the strategic scarcity that inflated US dominance in the first place. And once that scarcity vanished, the market recalculated everything. But the story didn't end there. America tried to fix the bubble. Repeatedly. The first attempted fix was regulatory dominance. US leaders pushed for international AI safety standards, which conveniently aligned with American capabilities. The narrative was simple. American companies should define the rules because American companies were the most advanced, but that argument weakened as Chinese models caught up. The second attempted fix was accelerated frontier model development. Companies rushed out versions of GPT 4.1, Gemini Ultra, Claude Opus, and Llama variants. But speed didn't solve the strategic problem. It made models more expensive, more complex, more reliant on hardware bottlenecks China no longer feared. The third attempted fix was doubling down on GPU production, with multi-trillion-dollar investments in domestic semiconductor capacity. But even that fix couldn't restore the narrative because China was no longer running America's race. China was running a different race entirely. One America had not trained for. Here's the twist. Most people miss. AI bubbles don't pop when technology fails. AI bubbles pop when assumptions fail. And America's biggest assumption, that it would always be 2 to 3 years ahead, died the moment China achieved AI scaling without American chips. Once that illusion disappeared, the bubble lost its inflation mechanism. You can see the parallels everywhere in modern history. The dot-com bubble didn't pop when the internet died. It popped when investors realized the economics didn't support the valuations. The housing bubble didn't pop when people stopped buying houses. It popped when the underlying risk assumptions collapsed. And now the AI bubble didn't pop because AI failed to deliver. It popped because America's monopoly narrative collapsed under pressure from a competitor it underestimated. Let's look at the repeating pattern. America assumes a near monopoly, gives valuations, inflate, gives competition arrives faster than expected, gives assumptions break, gives bubble collapses. It happened with manufacturing in the 1980s when Japan mastered lean production. It happened with telecom in the 1990s when Europe standardized GSM. It happened with solar in the 2000s when China scaled production. And now it is happening with AI not because China is copying America, but because China built an alternative AI ecosystem unconstrained by American bottlenecks. That is the part most analysts still down Tigresk. China didn't break America's AI bubble by surpassing America. China broke the bubble by invalidating the belief that only one country could innovate at scale. And the moment American exceptionalism died, the bubble died with it. So what does this mean going forward? 3 takeaways and 1 warning. AI supremacy is not predetermined. Power shifts when innovation decouples from hardware monopolies. The country that adapts fastest, not the country that starts ahead, wins the next phase of the race. Efficiency beats brute force. America believed compute scarcity would protect its lead. China proved algorithmic optimization can collapse bottlenecks and overturn assumptions overnight. Open models changed geopolitics. When China began releasing high-performance open-source models, the global AI ecosystem stopped revolving around Silicon Valley. Developers followed accessibility, not ideology. The real AI Cold War has barely begun. Not the war over models, not the war over chips. The war over who gets to define intelligence itself.